The 1980s school canteen, the clatter of trays, the smell of gravy, and that mix of dread and excitement as you queued up for whatever was on the menu. Some dishes were comforting, some were questionable, but all of them became part of growing up in Britain. From puddings smothered in custard to vegetables boiled within an inch of their life, these are the foods every child of the 80s remembers. If any of them take you back, don't forget to subscribe, and let's step into the dinner hall once more. No school dinner in 1980s, Britain felt complete without jam roly-poly. This classic sweat pudding, rolled up with a thick layer of sticky jam inside, was the star of the dessert trolley. It arrived in hefty slices, steaming hot, before being drowned in custard. Often so much custard you weren't sure where the pudding ended and the sauce began. For many kids, this was the highlight of the entire week. After trudging through soggy cabbage or lumpy mash, the sight of roly-poly on your tray felt like a reward. It was dense, chewy, and ridiculously sweet, but that was exactly why it worked. In a decade when school dinners didn't always win praise, jam roly-poly stood out as the dish everyone secretly hoped for. Ask anyone who grew up in the 80s, and chances are the memory of cutting into that spiraled slice and watching the jam swirl mix with custard still brings a smile. Few school puddings of the 1980s were as famous or as snigger-inducing as Spotted Dick. The name alone guaranteed giggles in the dinner queue, but once it hit your tray, the laughter usually gave way to eager spoons. Made from a heavy, sweet sponge studded with raisins or currants, the Spots, it was always served with a flood of custard. It wasn't light, it wasn't fancy, but it filled you up. Teachers liked it because it was cheap and practical. Dinner ladies liked it because it came in huge trays that could feed an army. And kids liked it because, despite the jokes, it was properly comforting. In many schools, you could smell Spotted Dick before you saw it. That warm, slightly fruity scent drifting across the hall. For those who grew up in the 80s, it became one of those desserts you didn't realize you'd miss until years later. Heavy, stodgy, and endlessly memorable, Spotted Dick was pure school dinner nostalgia. If there was one dessert that defined 1980s school dinners, it was treacle sponge, steamed until soft and springy, then smothered in golden syrup that ran down the sides in sticky rivers. It was the kind of pudding that glued your fork, and sometimes your fingers, together. Dinner ladies would cut it into hefty squares and drop them onto your plate with a ladle of custard, usually bright yellow and slightly lumpy. For kids it was heaven, sweet, gooey, and heavy enough to make you forget about the mystery meat you'd eaten 10 minutes earlier. Treacle sponge had a way of sticking in the memory, just like it stuck to the roof of your mouth. Some schools even served it with pink custard, which only made it feel more surreal and more 80s. It wasn't refined, but it didn't need to be. For children across Britain, treacle sponge pudding was pure comfort, a sugar-soaked finale that made the whole ordeal of the school canteen worthwhile. Among all the desserts of the 1980s school canteen, Cornflake Tart had a special place. It wasn't glamorous, but it was unforgettable. A thin, short-crust base spread with sticky strawberry jam, topped with a crunchy layer of golden cornflakes mixed with syrup and sugar. It looked deceptively simple, but once custard was poured over the top, it turned into something magical. The crunch softened just enough, the jam bled into the custard, and suddenly you had a pudding that felt both cheap and indulgent at the same time. Dinner ladies loved it because it was easy to make in massive trays, and kids loved it because it always felt like a treat. For many, it was the perfect balance between texture and sweetness. Crispy, sticky, soft, all in one bite. Ask anyone who went to school in the 80s, and Cornflake Tart will almost always appear in their list of favorites. It wasn't fine dining, but in the world of school dinners, it was close to perfection. Few school puddings from the 1980s were as instantly recognizable as the Manchester Tart. A crisp, short-crust pastry base, a smear of bright red jam, a thick layer of custard, and a topping of desiccated coconut, sometimes even with a slice of banana tucked inside. It was colorful, it was messy, and it was loved. Served in generous squares from giant trays, the tart had a way of crumbling in your hands, leaving pastry flakes everywhere. But that didn't matter. The mix of creamy custard, sharp jam, and coconut crunch made it worth every bite. Kids would argue over the banana slices, since not every piece had one. If you were lucky enough to get a portion with the fruit, you felt like you'd won a prize. For many children in the 80s, Manchester Tart was the taste of childhood. Cheerful, sweet, and slightly chaotic, just like the decade itself. Today, it's harder to find, but its place in school dinner nostalgia is secure. If there's one thing every 1980s schoolchild remembers, it's pink custard, strangely colored, oddly flavored, and poured in rivers over almost every pudding. It was the sauce that defined an era. Made from the same packet mixes as ordinary yellow custard, only dyed with food coloring, it somehow felt more exciting, more magical. When it appeared, it usually accompanied chocolate sponge, jam, roly-poly, or treacle pudding, turning them into something instantly unforgettable. The flavor, hard to pin down. Some swore it was just vanilla with coloring. Others insisted it had a faint strawberry note. Whatever it was, the mystery only added to its legend. For kids, the best part was watching it spread across the plate, soaking into cake and swirling with jam. Even if you didn't like it, you still remember it. And for many, pink custard is one of the most vivid, nostalgic symbols of school dinners in the 1980s. Bizarre, cheerful, and uniquely British. Long before Jamie Oliver declared war on school dinners, turkey drummers were a staple of the 1980s canteen. Shaped vaguely like a chicken leg, these breaded turkey pieces were crispy on the outside, soft, and a little mysterious on the inside. No one was entirely sure what they were made of, but nobody cared. Served with chips and beans, they were the kind of meal kids actually looked forward to. Unlike the grey stews or overcooked veg, turkey drummers had crunch, flavor, and most importantly, fun. They were the school dinner equivalent of fast food, and for many children, that made them feel like a treat. Of course, looking back, the quality was questionable, and health experts would shudder at the ingredients list. But in the 80s, none of that mattered. When those golden drummers landed on your tray, life instantly got better. For a whole generation, the memory of biting through that crispy coating is inseparable from growing up in Britain's school halls. If there was one combination guaranteed to cheer up a gloomy school day in the 1980s, it was chips, beans, and sausage. Simple, filling, and wonderfully messy, it was the kind of meal that felt like a small victory when it appeared on the menu board. The chips were rarely crispy, more often pale and floppy, but that didn't stop them being dunked into the lake of baked beans. The sausage, usually of the cheapest variety, sat on the side like a reluctant guest, but somehow completed the trio. And together, they created one of the most iconic school dinners of the decade. For many kids, this was the closest thing to comfort food the canteen ever served. It was warm, salty, and easy to eat fast before the bell rang. You didn't need fancy ingredients, just beans spreading across the plate, chips soaking it up, and a sausage to tie it all together. It may not have been gourmet, but to a child in the 80s, chips, beans, and sausage felt like the height of canteen luxury. Ask anyone who grew up in the 1980s about school pizza, and they'll probably picture the same thing. A thick, rectangular slab with barely a hint of tomato and a layer of melted cheese that stretched in strings. Forget artisan bases or fancy toppings. This was pizza, school dinner style. The base was more like bread than dough, chewy and heavy, but that made it filling. Sometimes you got a sprinkling of diced peppers or a lonely slice of ham, but most of the time it was just cheese on top. It arrived in great tray bakes, sliced into squares and slapped onto your plate, still steaming from the oven. For many kids, it felt exciting. Pizza was exotic back then, a taste of something cool and continental. Even if it didn't match up to the real thing, it was different enough from the usual beans or stews to feel special. To this day, the memory of rectangular school pizza remains vivid, thick, chewy, greasy, and strangely comforting. Fish fingers were a school dinner classic long before the 1980s, but in that decade, they reached peak canteen status. Lined up neatly on the tray next to a scoop of mashed potato, they were one of the few meals kids could count on to actually taste good. The mash was rarely smooth, more often lumpy, sometimes suspiciously watery, but it didn't matter. The real star was the fish finger. Crispy orange breadcrumbs on the outside, soft white fish on the inside. Add a splash of ketchup or drown the whole lot in gravy, and you had a meal that felt safe, familiar, and strangely satisfying. For many children, this was the kind of dish you actually wanted to see on the chalkboard menu. It wasn't just edible, it was enjoyable, which couldn't be said for every school dinner. Decades later, fish fingers still bring back that memory. The sound of cutlery scraping trays, the smell of gravy in the air, and the comfort of knowing lunch wasn't going to be a disaster. No memory of 1980s school dinners would be complete without the vegetables, and not in a good way. Cabbage that smelled like it had been boiled for hours, carrots that were mushy and pale, and peas that somehow managed to be both dry and soggy at the same time. They were piled onto trays whether you wanted them or not. Dinner ladies had a mission. Everyone got their 5 a day, even if those 5 were shades of green and orange that looked like they'd seen better decades. The smell of overboiled cabbage could drift through the hall long before lunch actually started, striking fear into every child in the queue. Yet, as much as we moaned, those veg became part of the ritual. Kids would trade them, hide them under mash, or push them around the tray until the bell rang. For better or worse, soggy cabbage and limp carrots are forever tied to the memory of the school canteen. Ask anyone from that era and you'll see the same grimace and then the same laugh. Corned beef pie was one of those dishes that summed up the school dinners of the 1980s perfectly. Cheap, filling, and built to feed an army. Made from tinned corned beef mixed with onions, potatoes, and sometimes carrots, it was baked beneath a heavy crust of pastry that could be either gloriously flaky or worryingly tough. When it was good, it was pure comfort food, savory, hearty, and warm on a cold school day. When it wasn't, it could be greasy, dense, and leave you wondering what exactly was inside. But either way, it always stuck in the memory. Dinner ladies served it in massive slabs, often with a scoop of mash and, of course, a side of overcooked veg. The taste was unmistakable, salty, meaty, and strangely satisfying in a way only school food could be. For many children, corned beef pie was a regular on the weekly rota. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. And even today, just hearing the words brings back the clatter of trays and the smell of pastry drifting through the canteen. Of all the curious pairings in 1980s school dinners, none was quite as strange or as memorable as chocolate sponge with mint custard. The sponge itself was simple, a dense, cocoa-flavored cake, baked in huge trays and cut into generous squares. But what made it unforgettable was the vivid green custard ladled over the top. It didn't really taste like mint as you'd know it today. It was more of a sweet, slightly toothpaste-like flavor that clashed wonderfully or horribly with the rich chocolate. Kids were divided. Some loved the novelty, others scraped it off and hoped for plain yellow custard instead. Still, it stood out. Among the puddings of the era, this was the one that sparked the most playground debates. It might not have been the best, but it was certainly one of the most talked about. For anyone who grew up in the 80s, the sight of green custard spilling over chocolate cake is impossible to forget. Proof that school dinners could be as weird as they were wonderful. If there's one dish that divided 1980s schoolchildren more than any other, it was semolina pudding. Made from milk and coarse wheat, it was thick, white, and gloopy, the kind of dessert that looked unappetizing even before it hit your tray. Served in bowls with a blob of jam in the middle, semolina had a texture you either tolerated or despised. Some kids stirred the jam through to give it color and sweetness, while others left it sitting on top like a sad target in a sea of bland mush. It was cheap, it was easy to make in huge pots, and it filled hungry stomachs, which is why it appeared so often. But for many, it's remembered as the low point of school dinners, a dish that made you wish you'd brought a packed lunch instead. Still, semolina pudding has its defenders. For some, it's tied to memories of warmth on a cold day, of clattering spoons in the canteen, and of childhood comfort. Proof that even the gloopy side of school food has a nostalgic charm. If there was ever a dessert that could brighten even the grayest school day, it was iced sponge with hundreds and thousands. A thick, plain sponge cake cut into neat squares and covered with a layer of bright white icing. It didn't look special at first, until the sprinkles appeared. Scattered in pink, yellow, and green, those tiny sugar dots turned a simple slab of cake into a celebration. Kids loved it not just for the taste, but for the way it looked. Cheerful, colorful, and nothing like the stodgy puddings that usually filled the canteen trays. The sponge itself was soft and sweet, the icing slightly crunchy, and the sprinkles added that little crackle under your teeth. Served with custard, of course, it was the kind of dessert that made you forget about the watery cabbage you'd suffered through earlier. For children of the 1980s, iced sponge with hundreds and thousands wasn't just a pudding, it was a moment of joy in the middle of the school week. Simple, bright, and unforgettable.